Hi guys. So my name is Sean. I'm going to talk a little bit about, share some thoughts I have about Bitcoin and kind of a hybrid economy, really thinking about how it interacts or needs to interact in a world in which fiat and digital currencies are sort of optimizations of one another. And this kind of builds on what, if I can figure out how to work this. Oops. I think this builds a little bit on what Jeremy, I can't work the clicker. This builds a little bit on what Jeremy was saying as well. This is really about sort of how does Bitcoin and the fiat economy world interact together. First, I wanted to give you an idea of who I am. This is just a random crawl of some stuff on a hard drive. I don't know exactly how helpful it is. I've done a lot of this stuff over about 20, 25 years of creating commercial software. Companies like Macromedia and Adobe, also some services, banking, financial institutions, some ad agencies. But I think the common thread really is a lot of us at Circle have a sort of shared background in being really interested in what data and information really is, how it exists in multiple places at the same time, how it's analyzed and evaluated and experienced, and then how it's sort of brought to the people who can use it and make it valuable, who aren't necessarily those who understand the underpinnings or the rails of the data. So a legitimate question is why even bother with the mainstream users or a hybrid economy at all? And it's not the only agenda, it's an agenda. I think there can be multiple agendas in parallel. We care a lot about sort of bringing it to, as Jeremy was saying, your grandparents or your children who don't necessarily understand what cryptocurrency is and don't necessarily need to in order to add value to all of us. So I think one of the things that adds value to all of us is dramatically ramping up the volume of transactions that occur in the Bitcoin system. So a lot of that is payments. It's not only payments, but it's partly payments. It's also partly figuring out how to, in a frictionless manner, get in and out of Bitcoin. So how does it feel more like, a currency exchange versus a trade for people who aren't going to understand trading metaphors and trading systems, even if there is an underlying order book. So if these people who don't necessarily understand the system in the way we do are still using Bitcoin for meaningful exchanges of goods and services, then obviously being a finite resource, the value of Bitcoin increases for all of us. There are a few challenges to getting Bitcoin really sort of seamlessly integrated with a frictionless economy. I'm only really going to talk about the middle one here, but there are some technical challenges. I'm going to speak about the gateway challenges, which are related to centralized forces like clearinghouses, banks, regulatory agencies. And then I think also there are some fundamental people and business model challenges, which I'll briefly touch on. So a few of the technical challenges are, obviously the transaction throughput is nowhere near something like, the 2,000 transactions per second that the Visa network can support. There is some privacy leakage. There's infrastructure maturity issues. The Satoshi client is still technically on point, heading for 0.9 release for people who care about release numbers. But a lot of these things are being addressed, and they're being solved in this sort of open, democratic, very transparent, peer-reviewed manner that I think we all fundamentally believe is the only way to progress these protocols. So people, for example, privacy leakage, people like Peter Todd and others have been talking about stealth addresses or static addresses or reusable addresses or whatever you want to call them. And I think these are the problems that get solved. And they're hard technical problems, but in sort of an open meritocracy as opposed to a closed lab, I think these things get solved. So I'm going to sort of move on to, I think, to me, right now, which is a harder problem than some of these technical issues, and it's how to deal with this sort of dealing with the gateways that want to tax and regulate privacy and levy tolls on getting into and out of the system. So I think this my thinking is that this does involve some technical evolution, but it also involves partnership with some of these people who are working in the gateways and controlling the system. So just a quick snapshot, sort of a refresher on how some of this stuff works. This kind of complicated diagram shows how a typical credit card transaction occurs. So the merchant here is requesting 100% of some cost. The consumer is authorizing the cost through a point-of-sale system. The merchant's payment processor is going to contact the card network, which will contact the issuing bank and figure out if, based on know your customer, anti-money laundering, anti-fraud, and other sort of rules built into the system, whether this is a charge that really should be authorized. If it is, they just go ahead and take 1.5% off, and they send back 98.5%. The card network sees it's authorized, so they take their fee as well, 0.15, and then they finally deliver it to the payment processor, which can charge anywhere between 0.35 and 0.45, and in some cases much higher, and then finally they deposit, in this example, 97.9% in the merchant's bank account. So obviously the cost of dealing with these central, and it's not just that the card network is the central gatekeeper, it's really every single one of these things is sort of a central gatekeeper. And there's some that aren't even in the diagram, all these sort of, know your customer, identity verification, and so forth services. So all these gatekeepers are basically collecting fees, not really on the value add that they're contributing to the transaction. They're taking fees on the actual rails or controlling access to the rails. And sort of similarly, this is a Nacha transfer in the US. These are really inexpensive. So these don't necessarily levy fees, but they levy a time cost. So in this case, the consumer is authorizing a merchant to collect some money out of the bank. It's kind of got to go into this giant central ACH system, which is backed by the central bank. So there's got to be a sort of centralized, each one of these is really centralized in this ACH system. So there's got to be a centralized collateral service, liquidity, more AML reporting. Eventually, 3 to 5 days later, the money winds up in the merchant's bank account. So whether it's credit card networks with fees or it's that kind of transfer with a bank, it's being time. Obviously, I'm not going to go through the Bitcoin system since we know how this works, but both of those problems are completely eliminated on the rails. When a customer wants to assign some unspent outputs to a merchant's address, it publishes those to a peer. At that point, without involving any of the mining or confirmation, anyone can validate that transaction is valid by checking the script that is on the transaction, which usually, obviously in a pay-to-address case, is just checking the pub private key mechanism. But eventually, this miner is going to pull this transaction out of the pool and stick it in a block that everybody can verify. So it's not really just these two who have a copy of the blockchain and can verify it, it's just everybody. So there is no none of these things are really centralized. Or even if, you want to consider, the consumer as being centralized, in the sort of view of the overall system, even the parties themselves aren't very centralized. Everybody's just a peer. So that's all fine and good until you have your grandmother who just wants to make a purchase through Bitcoin and doesn't necessarily understand all the details and has to go through something like this legacy fiat gateway. This isn't really a trade. She's not going on Bitstamp and acquiring Bitcoin or meeting somebody in person acquiring Bitcoin. She wants to do something like a currency exchange. So if the gateway evolves to support this kind of thing, it means all kinds of complicated policy and technical things like maintaining proper Bitcoin reserves to fund the transaction, proper fiat reserves. They have to have a banking relationship. These gateways aren't usually banks themselves, so they have to convince a bank that this is legitimate, and they have to have forward-thinking banking partners. All of this stuff sort of happens, and say the consumer is extended some form of short-term credit or somehow gets access to the Bitcoin, then it can flow through all these other consumers, and Bitcoin transactions, occur over time. Eventually, some consumers are going to want to go to another gateway to get that money out. Say they need to pay taxes or whatever it is. So this is another this is the opposite direction, but it's the same sort of frictionless exchange mechanism. So I think there are some technical things that we can do and some business policies that we can implement to make this sort of piece easier, but another way to approach the same problem at the same time is to find the people who have control of these gateways today, and not necessarily the bankers who bundle up mortgages and slice and dice them and make short-term gains and long-term losses and don't give loans and those people, but the few actual people in the organizations who are sort of forward-thinking and kind of get this and want this kind of distributed ledger system to be more a part of some of the legacy systems, which is a very slow evolution that they're going to need to undergo. But meanwhile, they kind of get it. And the decisions about, say, a banking partner understanding the risks and how this sort of works, it's not really just a monolithic bank that makes a decision. It's actual people at the banks who make the decision. So I think it's, people who work in these industries now, this whole system now is a massive opportunity for them to make major change. Which kind of gets to the people and business model issue. Someone, I think it was Martin Fowler, who once told me years ago that most really interesting technical problems can be sort of broken down into people problems. And I think this is true in this case too. It's this sort of tendency that people have to want to centralize and control access to core resources in order to protect themselves and secure value out of sort of self-interest. But the internet sort of consistently wants to push value up off the rails. So it's not that it removes value for these gatekeepers. It just means that they have to find it in a new place. And that's just evolution. And that's what some of those people actually do get that. You see that the internet is decentralized and democratized content production, media, politics, all of these different domains. It just hasn't done it yet to payments, but it's happening right now. This is the start of it, and some of these people really do get that. And so I guess my main thought is that as we're sort of innovating and contributing, whether it be actually arguing over pull requests in the Satoshi client or Mike's Bitcoin J or whatever it is, or people who are just trying to wrap their heads around the policy and how they can manage to bring their sort of legacy, create a batch file and SFTP it, or 70s world into to the modern world. This sort of innovation isn't closed off and available just to one group. It's available to all of us. And I would never bet against innovation in any regard to overcome these really, at first glance, very difficult problems. And I'm really excited that we're doing that at Circle, but I'm really excited to participate in this sort of global effort and doing that with all of you as well. So.
Thank you, Sean.